Yeah, I'm Adrian from the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia. I'm not an economist actually, and I'm not an impact evaluation specialist. So bear with me if my language is not as technical as many of the presentations, but I hope at any rate that what I have to say is of interest. I'm presenting on behalf of a group of co-authors and partners in Rwanda, and we'll try to tell you the story in a sense of our attempts to evaluate the impacts of a PES trial, a small-scale trial, and of course when we evaluate, sometimes that's what we want to do. We want to evaluate whether a pilot or a trial works before considering whether we scale it up. But evaluating at a small scale and evaluating things where you can't, for example, see the effects from the air, of course, adds its own sort of problems. The discipline I come from has been through some quite serious debate in the last 20 years or so, some of which has already been alluded to by previous speakers. You know, with these rather sort of highfalutin claims that the use of randomized experiments can transform social science and social policy in the 21st century in the same way as it transformed medicine in the 20th. And Angus Deaton, who Harold referred to earlier, obviously saying, well, actually things are rather more difficult when you're dealing with responses in complex behavioural systems than when you're dealing with responses in sort of biophysical entities. And others have been considerably ruder about RCT methods than them. And that's unfortunate in a way, that you get a sort of slightly unhelpful, I guess in 20 years ago we'd have called it a science war between the sort of qualitative and quantitative methodologists. And so for that reason I'm delighted to be here. I was delighted to hear sort of Alex's introductory talk, in which there was a sort of, you know, we could somehow, there's hope that we can tunnel through those sort of for and against kind of debates and look at how different methodologies can actually work together. So in my first part of this presentation, I'm going to be more sort of oriented to telling the, I guess, the experimental story. But in the second part, it's more a case of trying to throw everything we learned from this trial at trying to come up with the best story that we could, to use that language that Alex presented to us. So the trial itself took place in the southwest of Rwanda around the Nyungwe National Park. And was a PES in which we tried to contract, or did contract, local communities to help support biodiversity through reduction of certain activities within the park, which authorities and others considered to be, I suppose, detrimental to biodiversity. So the conservation efforts that we measured were snares, the use of snares for hunting, cutting of trees, cutting of new trails through the forest, and mining, predominantly gold mining. And we offered payments to communities contingent on performance related to this on a sort of sliding scale. So it wasn't a sort of payment versus no payment, but you were paid according to the level of reduction in these activities. And important to notice that this was not this was investment in a public good as such. So it was, we could only measure impacts collectively. So so this was a collective action problem, although most of the payment went to individual households. So we measured community performance, but we rewarded primarily, not completely, at a household level. And approximately, our unit, what we call a cell, is about 1,000 households. It varies a bit, or about 5,000 people. So between 15 and 20,000 people were involved in this trial, or around 4,000 households. The two main forms of data, which I'll sort of refer to were georeferenced monitoring of human activity within the forest. So people actually observing the use of snares and trees that had been cut, bamboo that had been cut, and so on. And there was two types of this data. Firstly, we did it ourselves. So we undertook a baseline followed by 6 further rounds of a team of trained monitors carrying GPS systems and so on, going around each of the cells in the forest adjacent to these cells and counting these activities. But we also had access to the Rwandan Park Authority's own ranger-based monitoring for the park as a whole, so not just for our experimental and control cells. In addition, I will draw on other data. We carried out a before and after livelihood and opinion survey with, well, before 384 households, after 376, plus semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and actually the experimental economics is the one set of data I'm currently unable to really integrate. Our initial design selected 4 experimental cells and 4 matched controls. But we also have this, I'll talk a bit about how that didn't sort of work out perfectly really, but we also have this through the park authorities, ranger-based monitoring. We also have this with the rest of the park as a second larger control. We ran a series of GLMs with human activity as the response variable to try and ascertain whether there was a difference between the experimental cells and what was originally our control cells. 2 things to say about this first selected model which came out. I must apologize, I'm not the statistician in the group, but I will try and convey the key things. First thing is that we do find, as highlighted, a significant difference between the experimental cells and the control cells, with less human activity within the experimental cells. But secondly, critically, we don't find an interaction variable between cell type and month, i.e. we don't necessarily know that there's any difference in the rate of change over time between our experimental cells and control cells. So to put this qualitatively, this is how things might be happening based on the first selected model using our own data. That whilst we find some decline in human activity in the experimental cells, it may well be that the control cells are declining at the same rate, albeit at a slightly higher level. And, of course, it may well be that both of these trends simply reflect a park-wide trend and that the PES has had no effect whatsoever. So that's our sort of first, at the top, our first sort of possible interpretation of this data, that the PES was ineffective. Our second interpretation is that the so-called controls were actually contaminated and were not serving as controls. So we then looked to the government's park-wide data, and just to look at the, oh, no, it's completely wrong. I didn't want to have a quite diagram. But anyway, if we just look at the top left-hand one, something's happened to the slide. What we can just visualise, if we plot that data of human activity over time, is that park-wide there seems to be an upward trend in human activity rather than downwards. If we take that to the GLMs, 2 things come out of it. Firstly, again, we find a difference between cells. So again, we're confirming a significant difference between the experimental cells and the other cells. And this time, we are also having finding an interaction between month and cell type, suggesting that there is a trend over time with the experimental cells behaving differently. So, where are we? We found with our own data that we found sort of similar potentially similar rates of change for experimental and control cells. We don't think this is simply reflecting a park-wide trend. Therefore, that leaves us thinking that the controls must have been contaminated. You can see this is a slightly sort of tortured story of how our experiment ran. So the first thing we tested for, I'll skip this fairly quickly, is whether there's a so-called John Henry effect. John Henry was the sort of legendary railway worker in late 19th century USA, I think, and when he understood he was being compared to a new steam piler or steam hammerer or whatever, he worked himself to death trying to sort of outperform the steam engine. So in a sense we were asking, well were the people in our controls aware that they were controls, and therefore did they sort of, was there a halo effect, I suppose, would be one way of putting it. But we found, to cut the story short, we found little evidence of that. So what else was it? So we then sort of asked, well, what we think probably happens is the very impact of our monitoring, that the fact that we were increasing the rate of the level of observation in these controls was itself what changed behaviour. So we went and asked people, well, in the controls, did you perceive greater interaction with park authorities? And I said yes. So what we began to understand was actually they saw our teams of people monitoring the forest. They didn't distinguish between our people monitoring the forest and park guards. They thought they were park guards. So actually, we ended up not with an experimental cells and controls, but with experimental cells with PES plus more monitoring, and controls that were actually just more guards. Which might not be great news to people like me who sort of prefer, have a sort of tendency towards community forms of forestry as opposed to just sort of parks and fences, because it seems to suggest that you can achieve the same effect for far less money than a PES by simply putting more guards in the field. But okay, so here's switching to sort of throwing everything and trying to understand the story a bit better, and trying to. And our view is actually that whilst the effects may ostensibly appear to be the same in terms of conservation impact, we don't think that the effect is quite the same. And we call it an equity story, but it's really our best attempt to explain what is different between the PES and just the sort of more guards alternative, I suppose. Well, we think that the conservation behaviour is the same, but for different motives. That those, and this is not surprising at all, that in one case people are changing their behaviour based on perception of more guards, in the other based on financial incentives. So we think that this was the critical difference, not what people do, but why they did it, and what they were, in a sense, thinking about, for want of a better term, whilst doing it. And again, this is where we draw in theory. We think that the motivational crowding theory can help us to understand that. And as I'll say in a minute, I think that equity is a key issue there. If we look to that motivation crowding literature, what we will find is that actually various kinds of incentives are often it's deemed as markets, which, if you like, are the corruptor of other motives. But it could be markets, it could be other kinds of financial incentives, it could be fear arising from guards. But we know that strengthening some motives or incentives will affect other motives, will affect people's moral framing of the situations that they face. Crowding in, crowding out is often presented as the main example of that. In our particular case, actually, we don't particularly see PES as crowding in or out, but we see that perceptions of fairness will tend to crowd in, whilst perceptions of inequality and unfairness will tend to crowd out. And the PES, in this case, was considered, we think, more fair than just more guards. So PES, in a sense, was more of a crowder in than a crowder out, contrary to a lot of the sort of literature that's out there. The key thing, however, is that we find that perceptions of fairness matter. And if we have a little bit of evidence in support of this, not a lot, but if we had our time again, we would have focused more on trying to employ theory and to really understand the story that we thought was happening. But two references to evidence that we can put forward. Firstly, in before and after sort of household surveys, we do find a difference between experimental and control cells. Here, if we just look at the after in 2012, these are based on 1 to 5 Likert scales, agreeing with what the main factor was that stops people entering the park: law enforcement, involvement, environmental education, and so on. And we do find a difference. In controls, for example, people are far more likely to agree that it's law enforcement that makes people not go into the park. In the experimental cells, people are more likely to agree that environmental education makes a difference. But if I'm honest, more importantly perhaps to our story is the qualitative data we gain through semi-structured interviews at the local level. And I'm not presenting it here, but we've done some content analysis of this qualitative work. But just illustrative, we find that people say very different things in terms of why they are protecting the forest. In the experimental cells, they're tending to say various positive things. You might say, well, they would say that to us because we're sort of running the experiment. And in the control cells, they refer to issues related to fear. Well, we don't want to go into the forest because people get shot and beaten and so on. And these kind of expressions and descriptions of what was happening were far more frequent in the control cells. So to sum up and draw a few conclusions. Firstly, some sort of substantive conclusions about the case study itself. I mean, clearly, based on the data that we have, we would say that our trial, PES, was effective in the sense that it created additional conservation to what we found in the park as a whole, but not really efficient in the sense that it generated evidence that you could achieve that same additionality through a cheaper means, if you like, through more guards. However, if we factor in this admittedly more speculative storyline about equity and motives, then the PES might be more sustainable. If one agrees with me that conservation based on motives of fear is likely to be less sustainable long term than conservation based on other motives. So both work in terms of observable effects, but maybe one is better. Maybe both work, but maybe one is right. And methodologically, in terms of some conclusions, clearly I have no doubt at all that attempting to construct counterfactuals using experimental design added to our ability to infer causality and was clearly beneficial. But field level does pose very serious constraints, particularly ethical ones. For example, we simply cannot, well, we don't think, ethically conduct blinded controls in which we don't inform people before they consent to being part of our study. It also places constraints on randomisation. And also we think that the addition of careful observational case study, including ethnographic work, will always contribute to understanding why things are happening and advance our scientific understanding and advance theory in ways which perhaps an RCT alone can't. And my final call is that I see often in the papers that I read, particularly in preparation for this meeting, the term rigorous to describe sort of RCT and experimental methods, which I find a sort of slight sort of red flag. But thank you very much, and I hope that was